Live from Washington, D.C., Jay Sekulow Live. Phone lines are open for your questions right now. And now, Chief Counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice, Jay Sekulow.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the broadcast. We've got a lot to talk about, and some of it, much of it, very disturbing. We're going to deal with a variety of topics today, but I want to first start with this shooting in Poway, California. A 19-year-old man who authorities said gave himself up to police shortly after carrying out a deadly shooting in a Southern California synagogue that was on the Sabbath, Saturday. So it was filled with worshipers. He's under investigation also regarding an unresolved case of arson involving a mosque. They think it's the same guy. He's reportedly a white nationalist, anti the president, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim. That's what we know right now on this, Jordan.
Yeah, it's why I think that, I see some of these like the ADL and Anti-Defamation League try to tie this actually to the president and to politics in America. And let's just be honest about it. These people that commit these attacks are neither left nor right. To call them right-wing extremists, I think, is to do a disservice to just a basic political spectrum. These are individuals who dislike the president because of anti-Semitism and his support for Israel. They dislike Muslims because of they don't believe Muslims can be good Americans. It's like the list goes on and on and on about it. They're not even on a normal political spectrum. They are white supremacists. I think that's the fair thing to call them, similar to neo-Nazis. And there is a rise of it around the world. We're now seeing more of it here. It used to be the rise was happening in Western Europe, Eastern, Central, and Western Europe. Now we're seeing it here. This attack on Saturday was 6 months to the day of that even more deadly attack
Tree of Life
in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where 11 worshipers were killed, 6 other wounded. That was the deadliest attack against Jews ever on U.S. soil. So this was, again, also came with Easter weekend. Let's not forget the attacks in Sri Lanka by Islamic extremists. So extremism, certainly a problem, and it's targeting people of faith directly, and how we have to kind of move forward. But I think that one of the problems is what has been acceptable political discourse. You've got an example in your hand
this as one right
that
here.
has been allowed to be published in an international New York Times, which goes to the entire world.
Yeah, so the next time the New York Times talks about that, the president or others are using rhetoric that encourages anti-Semitism, here is a picture of a cartoon of a blind President Trump.
The yarmulke.
Wearing a yarmulke, wearing glasses indicating that he has lost his vision, with a dog whose face is Benjamin Netanyahu with the Star of David around the dog's neck. And that basically Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is leading the blind, and the blind is the President of the United States. References to Jews as dogs, and I take this very personally, is outrageous because that's one of the oldest forms of anti-Semitism. And in Europe, the New York Times in Europe did this, and their response is, it was the work of a single editor who was working without adequate oversight and downloaded the syndicated cartoon and made the decision to include it. By the way, on all the pages it went on, the opinion page of the New York Times International
No explanation.
version.
It didn't even have
no
text
explanation,
with it. It was just there.
no text with it. A picture of a blind president of the United States, Donald Trump, being led by a dog whose face was Benjamin Netanyahu's. Outrageous? You bet. These papers have the nerve to say it's the president or it's Republicans or it's conservatives in doing this. Put that up on the screen again for everybody to see it. You got to point to the evidence on that. The face of Benjamin Netanyahu leading a blind Donald Trump. And Benjamin Netanyahu's face is on the body of a dog with a Star of David. Folks, we're taking a break. When we come back from that break, we'll be taking more of your calls and comments. It's a very serious issue, the rise of anti-Semitism. And the New York Times running this political cartoon is outrageous, coming on the heels of the shooting at the synagogue. This is just horrific. We've got a petition up because we think these congressmen that are promoting this anti-Semitism need to be censured. Sign that petition at aclj.org or call the number that's on your screen, aclj.org. It's the easiest way for you to do it. We encourage you to do it. We'll be back with more in just a moment.
The rise of anti-Semitism is deeply concerning and problematic. All too often, we see the hate unfold before our very eyes. The deadly violence permeates our world. Synagogues are now the targets of attacks. At the American Center for Law and Justice, we're fully engaged in the battle to defend Israel's interests and the Jewish people from these kind of hateful attacks. We're fighting at the UN and at the International Criminal Court. Anti-Semitism is now in full display in Congress and in the media outlets. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has repeatedly engaged in anti-Semitic rhetoric. She said that support for Israel is, quote, all about the Benjamins, a bigoted accusation that Jews control all the money. And the New York Times published a blatantly anti-Semitic cartoon targeting President Trump and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu. When we have politicians making anti-Semitic comments and mass media outlets publishing anti-Israel and anti-Jewish cartoons, it's time to take action. Add your name to our petition to stop anti-Semitism now, online at aclj.org.
Harry, give us your kind of overview analysis of how serious of a problem this is, and we're going to get to some calls.
Well, I think this is an incredibly serious problem. We should put this problem in context. We should put this problem in the context of a worldwide phenomena of rising anti-Semitism. And so if you look, for instance, at Great Britain, the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, he is an anti-Semite, plain and simple. And if we look at the New York Times, we should note that the New York Times needs to apologize, but they need to apologize for more than a mistake by a single editor or for an editorial process. They need to apologize for more than this particular cartoon. Why is that? This cartoonist has a history of despicable and vile behavior that goes back at least to 1983. And so the New York Times continued, as I understand it, to employ this individual for almost 40 years. And so the claim that this was a simple mistake by a single editor, I think that is nonsense. And so, again, let's put this in context. The New York Times is prepared to use anti-Semitism when it advances the New York Times' political agenda.
The New York Times could do something other than blaming it on a lone editor. They're not. Okay, so let's be clear with what's...
They're not going to unless they have to.
No.
They're not going to take it a step further.
And then in Europe, it's in vogue to be anti-Semitic. Again, we've been through this before in recent history, and it appears to be the case again. Now, the difference is you got a state of Israel, and you've got leadership in the United States that's not going to tolerate anti-Semitism. But I think, look, if you look at our nation's university campuses right now, Cece was talking about this during the break. I mean, the fact is, how many cases have we had? I mean, I think probably a half dozen, maybe more, students, professors that are being harassed because they're pro-Israel or Jewish.
And it's okay. They think it's okay because these universities and the United Nations, they have gotten away with it for years and years.
We just had, you asked, we had a recent case? Yes, Emory University.
Yeah.
Emory University had authorized, with their signature, in the residential dorms for students, the social justice for Palestine students, to put eviction notices up on Jewish students' dorm rooms with Emory seal of approval on it. Because to make them know what it feels like to be taken out of your own land. Emory apologized, but have they done anything? Is there accountability? And how in the world did the seal of Emory University, which, by the way, used to have, when I went there, a pretty high Jewish population, how did that happen? All right, let's go ahead and take a call.
Back to the phones we go. Bill in Wyoming. Bill, welcome to Jay Sekulow Live.
Hey, Bill.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my call. Just a real quick thought. Wonder how many of these newspapers, how many editors do they have to begin with? Now, my statement, which...
let me just say one thing there. The New York Times, a lot. But to have the authority to pull something out of a syndication column, this was a syndicated political cartoon, and put it on the opinion page of the New York Times International Edition, you have to have a lot of authority. But go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to make a statement which I would pose as a question to the whole panel. It seems to me that we have an attitude there in Congress right now that if I get elected, I can go up there, stand on my soapbox, and say anything horrendous and get away with it. Am I correct?
Yeah. I mean,
well, it depends on who you're saying it about.
It depends on who you're saying about and which party you're at.
I mean, if you're a Republican and you say something wrong, and like Steve King is a good example of it, you are stripped of your committee. They can't unelect you. You can still run for Congress, but you can have no influence in Congress. And you could debate wrong or right about that, but that is a swift move, always by Republicans, I say. Always swift, even when sometimes questionable. I'm not saying it was the Steve King matter. I'm saying even when it's sometimes questionable, they are swift to disempower those who have made comments, who have abused their official office to make comments which could be seen as racist or anti-Semitic or anything that offends the conscience of the American people to the point where we believe it's, as a nation, it is wrong and reprehensible. Republicans are always quick. Sometimes they're criticized for being too quick to condemn their own, too quick to censure their own. Here, no one is saying that Democrats need to remove Ilhan Omar from office. You know what? Let voters decide. If that district in Minnesota wants to keep electing an anti-Semite congresswoman, they can. But Nancy Pelosi doesn't have to give her powerful committee chairs like the Foreign Affairs Committee. Elliot Engel, as the chairman of the committee, doesn't have to go along with it. She would be her influence would drop so dramatically if she was removed from a Foreign Affairs Committee where she gets classified briefings on American foreign policy, because she'd just be another one of the 435 members of Congress, many of which are kind of nutty. I'll be honest with you. Many of which are pretty nutty, and you don't hear from much because of that. They're just kind of written off as, people don't pay enough close attention to who they're electing. You don't have to empower, and that is why you don't see 435 members of Congress on television. You see the handful that are decided to be empowered. Now, sometimes the media will try to take a outlier like Ilhan Omar and push them out because it's an interesting story. That gave the Nancy Pelosi's of the world an opportunity to dismiss her as a influential member of the party. And instead, they did not. They could not even get a condemnation together. And so they're allowing her to continue to spread out. And I think, when you look at the attacks, it was the first night of Passover, Friday, so Good Friday also. And then it was Saturday. And listen, people are busy. I know we're doing other things, not always, all religious things during those days. But then Saturday, again, you get the Passover. Then then of course Easter Sunday. And the Democrats were out there campaigning like it was totally normal on for Good Friday and Saturday. So start beginning of Passover and Good Friday. I feel like unless you are a kind of Muslim extremist like Ilhan Omar, it's just become like an anti-religious party. Yeah. Some of that may be because even the Joe Biden types have gotten, the Catholic Church has said, it's really not appropriate for you to be taking communion when you have these views on abortion. They've said that to Nancy Pelosi and others. So their own religious movements have said, you can't have this both ways. You can't say, as a Catholic, I believe this, but as a life begins at conception, as Joe Biden says, and as a politician, I am not going to vote that way. So I think that anti-religious sentiment also fuels these radical attacks. Yep. Because you see these religious people as outliers in the community instead of being the mainstream, which is in America, most are people of faith.
Now, I'm glad that CNN condemned it. I am glad that Brian Seltzer went on there and said those things. But there's got to be more, Harry, than that for this to have an impact. That there appears to be no consequence.
I think that is precisely correct. And so what we need is a bipartisan movement by both Democrats and Republicans to condemn these outrageous attacks. And it's very, very important to note that these attacks continue not necessarily only at the New York Times, but they include anti-Semitism on university campuses. In today's news package, there was a news story indicating that 3,000 students at DePaul University sought university censure for Jason Hill, a Jamaican American. Why? Because he supports Israeli sovereignty over lands captured as a result of a war commenced by the surrounding Arab nations. These students sought to label Professor Hill a racist for supporting Israel. In reality, this is anti-Semitism, plain and simple. So it's important to note that we need to oppose with every fiber of our being what's going on at the New York Times, but also what is going on university campuses from New York to California.
Folks, we're taking a break. When we come back from that break, we'll be taking more of your calls and comments. It's a very serious issue, the rise of anti-Semitism. And the New York Times running this political cartoon is outrageous, coming on the heels of the shooting at the synagogue. I mean, this is just horrific. We've got a petition up because we think these congressmen that are promoting this anti-Semitism need to be censured. Sign that petition at aclj.org or call the number that's on your screen, aclj.org. It's the easiest way for you to do it. We encourage you to do it. We'll be back with more in just a moment.
The rise of anti-Semitism is deeply concerning and problematic. All too often, we see the hate unfold before our very eyes. The deadly violence permeates our world. Synagogues are now the targets of attacks. At the American Center for Law and Justice, we're fully engaged in the battle to defend Israel's interests and the Jewish people from these kind of hateful attacks. We're fighting at the UN and at the International Criminal Court. Anti-Semitism is now in full display in Congress and in the media outlets. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has repeatedly engaged in anti-Semitic rhetoric. She said that support for Israel is, quote, all about the Benjamins, a bigoted accusation that Jews control all the money. And the New York Times published a blatantly anti-Semitic cartoon targeting President Trump and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu. When we have politicians making anti-Semitic comments and mass media outlets publishing anti-Israel and anti-Jewish cartoons, it's time to take action. Add your name to our petition to stop anti-Semitism now. Online at aclj.org.
Go to the phones in the last segment, 800-684-3110. Let's do it.
John in Washington State on line 2. John, welcome to Jay Sekulow Live.
Hi, John.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you so much for all the wonderful work that you do on behalf of all that's righteous.
Thanks.
And I'm so saddened by this attack by these terrorists. And I'm also saddened and more than disappointed at the anti-Semitic rhetoric nonsense that came from the New York Times.
Cece?
Yeah, well, I'm saddened, too, even by their lame apology. Because as I read it, what's missing is actually the most important part. They say they're deeply sorry for the publication of anti-Semitic political cartoon and that they're committed to making sure nothing like this ever happens again. But what they don't say is that it's not their position. They don't say that we are condemning this and we are going to fire this editor because he does not speak for us. This is not the position of the New York Times. They don't say any of that. They just say, oh, they're saddened and they're going to,
and it is anti-Semitic.
They're going to make sure that it doesn't ever happen again. Well, it shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Yeah. Also, this is
ever.
like the blaming the editor. By the way, this editor couldn't have been such a low-level editor if he or she had the authority to take something out of a syndicated political cartoonist and put it on the opinion page of the New York Times International, Harry. That's a lot of authority. A lot of authority.
Absolutely. So I think we should start and reemphasize Cece's point. There's an absence of real consequences with respect to the apology. So they should have accompanied the apology with the fact or the notice that they had indeed fired the editor, that they had indeed fired the cartoonist, that they had indeed fired each and every staffer who shared these same anti-Semitic sentiments. Instead, as Cece rightly points out, they issued an extremely lame excuse. And this follows a distinguished pattern, the pattern that includes, I should say, Nancy Pelosi. Yes, we want to condemn in the broadest terms possible anti-Semitism, but we don't want to do anything about it. So there were absolutely no consequences for Representative Ilhan Omar's anti-Semitic comments, and she is still a member of Congress. She is still on a House committee, and the Democratic leadership has done nothing. So the key issue here is the absence of consequences, and without consequences, these apologies are simply lame.
At the same time, same weekend that this is running, and they are, and the shooting is happening at the synagogue in California. It is President Trump and his advisors who are the neo-Nazis. I mean, that's what they're basically saying, that they are the dog whistlers, they are the extremists, they are the problem, and yet they are running the most anti-Semitic imagery right out of Nazi propaganda. As Brian Seltzer said from CNN, who used to work at the New York Times. Here's the rabbi again. He spoke to President Trump. He called into MSNBC about this, actually. The rabbi did. So I'm sure they were a bit surprised because he spoke to President Trump. He talks about how, I don't know if we have it in this clip, but he said he spoke to the president for almost an hour. It's not in our clip, but this is, I think, the key part, bite 14.
I received a personal phone call from our President Donald Trump. He shared with me condolences on behalf of the United States of America, and he spoke about his love of peace and Judaism and Israel, and he was just so comforting that I'm really grateful to our president for taking the time and making that effort to share with us his comfort and consolation.
The president has Jewish grandchildren. Yeah. So let me tell you, it's as I can relate.
I will say too, as you know, it's the rabbi there. He does not make that distinction like they always try to make between being anti-Israel. He says the Judaism and Israel. Right. The president spoke about his love for.
They always try to separate that out and say you can be anti-Zionist, you're not anti-Israel, but that's anti-Jewish.
This is now the anti-Semitism being spread around the world under what started out as a cloak of being anti-Zionist, and now I think they're just letting their true selves be.
Oh yes,
shown.
absolutely.
Because now that I'm trying to really do that.
Well, just think about this for a moment. What possessed the New York Times to think that would? Why was that appropriate under any circumstance?
During Passover?
The last days of Passover. Yeah. This is, Passover's a 7-day holiday. Who in the New York Times thought, I've got a great idea. Let's take this political cartoon that shows a Jewish leader as a dog, and that his collar is a Star of David, leading a blind president of the United States.
With a yarmulke on.
And the president of the United States is wearing a yarmulke. And they thought this was okay. I mean, just let that sink in for a minute. They thought this was okay. And that should tell you what we're dealing with. Let's take another call.
Linda in California on line 1. Linda, welcome to Jay Sekulow Live.
Hey, Linda.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much for taking my call. It's saying, the frustration and of how you see the double standard, how they they know they get away with it. That's why they do it. If it would have been on the other side and, consequences, people get fired, condemned and everything. But in this side, we don't hear anything, from, just like a lame excuse.
The New York Times says they're sorry. But I want to say this, and I think it's worth playing again. Let's play Brian Seltzer, CNN. This is CNN, a guy that worked for the New York Times. I think it's worth playing it again.
The New York Times is a great newspaper. I used to work there, but this is inexcusable. This was something that was straight out of Nazi propaganda. And the idea that any editor there, even some obscure editor in some far-flung office, would see this and think it was appropriate is shocking. And I'm glad there's been this level of concern and condemnation all the way from the president on down around the world, because the Times needs to be held accountable on this.
The fact that any editor with the New York Times thought this was appropriate. Let that sink in for a moment. Someone that had editorial authority from the New York Times, the authority to take a syndicated political cartoonist imagery and place it on the opinion page of the New York Times International Edition, which is probably the largest international newspaper in the world. And he thought that was okay, or she. We don't know if it's a man or a woman. And they thought that was okay. That's what you have got to be thinking about. Why would that imagery, put it up on the screen again, why would this imagery be okay in any circumstance? The leader of the Jewish peoples, the Jewish state, Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is the face of a dachshund. The collar tag is a Star of David. The leash is connected to the President of the United States, who has glasses on as if he is blind, wearing a yarmulke. And somebody at the New York Times thought this was okay. Not just somebody that had the authority to take it from a syndicated artist's rendering, that's what these are, syndicated political cartoons, and stick it on the opinion page of the New York Times. Shame on the New York Times. Shame on all of us to let this go without any kind of repercussion. The repercussion needs to be serious here, and that is the New York Times owns more than an apology, okay? Action needs to be taken. That's going to do it for the broadcast today. We've got a petition up. We think the congressmen and women that are spewing this anti-Semitism, that's one direct action we can take here, need to be censured. And they could do that in Congress. Not just said, oh, that's inappropriate. There needs to be some action. We encourage that to take place. Sign the petition at aclj.org or call the number that's on your screen right now. We encourage you to do that. Also, pray for our team. We're fighting this in court. We're fighting this at the UN. We're fighting this through our offices in Jerusalem. Your support makes a huge difference to the ACLJ. We encourage you to do it. We'll be back with you next week.
The rise of anti-Semitism is deeply concerning and problematic. All too often, we see the hate unfold before our very eyes. The deadly violence permeates our world. Synagogues are now the targets of attacks. At the American Center for Law and Justice, we're fully engaged in the battle to defend Israel's interests and the Jewish people from these kind of hateful attacks. We're fighting at the UN and at the International Criminal Court. Anti-Semitism is now in full display in Congress and in the media outlets. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has repeatedly engaged in anti-Semitic rhetoric. She said that support for Israel is, quote, all about the Benjamins, a bigoted accusation that Jews control all the money. And the New York Times published a blatantly anti-Semitic cartoon targeting President Trump and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu. When we have politicians making anti-Semitic comments and mass media outlets publishing anti-Israel and anti-Jewish cartoons, it's time to take action. Add your name to our petition to stop anti-Semitism now. Online at aclj.org.